Christy. It is Sunday. Welcome to Weekend Winters. I hope you guys are doing well. Welcome to bad hair conditions week 4. Yeah, I don't know about all y'all, but I'm just gonna hug my hairdresser when I get out of this stuff. It has been a real trip to realize how I could live when the zombie apocalypse actually shows up. So, one thing I found out, I now know exactly how many sheets of toilet paper I need for various things, so I can ration them out appropriately. Because I did manage to find toilet roll at the bottom of my road, as they'd say, in the UK, but I can't go and get like a whole stack of it, so I'm very conscious. So I'm super rationing out my own toilet roll, and I've had to upgrade from level 1 hair maintenance to level 2 hair maintenance. So you're baldy, no need to go to the hairdresser. Oh, it saves you so much money. That's nice. And also I see, who was it that was in you were Lucky Wanderer. You're out playing bocce ball in the backyard with your family. They're so competitive, huh? That's nice. At least it's something to do, I guess, on the Easter Sunday. So, as you guys might remember, I went on and on about how I had to do my own bangs. Or fringe. Depends on what you want to call it. And I think I would give myself like an 8 out of 10. I got the line straight, most important. And I got it above my eyebrows, but not like up here. So I guess as long as it's not noticeable that I did my own fringe, I think that's a win. I'm going to call that a win for the first time out and never practicing. But to do level 2, I had to take it up a notch. So I last got my hair cut. I was overdue when the lockdown happened. I think I've said that I started on the 13th of March. I actually think I started on the 18th of March. It's just not that important. But sorry, I'm also running a game that I'm playing. It's running in the background. Anyway, and so I was already like 4 weeks or 6 weeks from my last haircut when I made an appointment, but then the lockdown expanded. First, we could see hairdressers, and I got my nails done right before the lockdown went down. And then they stopped that, like the next Monday, which is when I had my appointment, or the Tuesday or whatever. So I had to deal with my hair. And the back of it was getting really long. Like, it's supposed to be a 20s bob. So it's supposed to be very clean at the back, to kind of give that sort of whoop, swoopy kind of thing. And I had probably 2 centimeters, would you call that, of growth over 2 months. It had probably been 2.5 months or something. And it's not a huge amount, but it was getting to the point where it was like flipping. It was like kind of coming up and doing weird stuff in the back, and I can't deal with this anymore. So I got my clippers out, and I was like, I want to trim up the back, but how am I going to do that, right? Because what I ended up having to do was go into the bathroom, get out the guards. I didn't want to just start zooming away there, and dang it, got distracted. Started zooming away back there, and so I had to, in the mirror, behind my back, one-handed, figure out how to clean up my neckline. Happily, I did that. So can you guys see? But I really want just a hairdresser again. I just want my hairdresser again, because next it's gonna have to be the sides, and I really don't want to have to figure out. I don't have good scissors. I don't have decent scissors, so it's gonna be really painful to try to trim this up. Anyway. Lucky Wanderer in the chat says, my sister is a hairdresser, and getting her to cut my hair when I had it was impossible. Oh, really? She's just so busy. Be right back. Gonna get something. Okay. Go get something. Awesome. Right. So, guys, that was it. That was the morning chit-chat, just to wake up my voice a little bit. And, so I guess what I did learn coming out of this is that if I can't get an appointment with the hairdresser, I do have a few tricks up my sleeve that I can use to keep myself looking at least acceptable, at least not looking weird. But oh man, I'm gonna be so ready for the hairdressers. All right, Tom Hanks says just save it all off. Yeah, that definitely would save some money. I'm not that far off it's really short hair that I have. So it wouldn't be the strangest thing in the world for me to do. All right. I wanted to talk, I was really, so I had a pretty big week, like streaming wise. I did 2 D&D games. I did a show, COG hosted with Kevin over on Twitch. And what else? And now this show. So I didn't have too much time to think about content. I don't want you guys to feel bad, but like a lot of times I come up with the show content like when I have to come up with a title for the show. But this was a very good article I want to share with you guys because it's important to understand why your candidates lose if you want to not lose the next time. So in hindsight, one thing that I would say, good morning, Flint. One thing I would say is that Clinton did not properly appreciate the extent to which misogyny would plague her on the left. I think that looking back now to 2016, you can see that there was a lot of, and you could also say it's anti-Hillary, like her personally. She was personally responsible for the reason people didn't like her. Although I think it's also fair to say that 2 years of nonstop Republican attacks had an effect. When she left the office as Secretary of State, she was actually quite popular. And then after 2 years of just nonstop taxpayer-funded negative or opposition campaigning against her, they had really worn down her positives. So Joe Biden doesn't face that problem this time, in part because he doesn't have a kind of role that Clinton had. And also the coronavirus situation is just sucking up a couple things. The benefit that Biden now, looking back, has over Clinton. Clinton had 2 years of negative campaigning put out against her. And also not just those 2 years focused on her, but of course the entire time that her husband was president and she was first lady. She didn't really get, I don't think, as much flack as a U.S. senator. And she didn't get too much flack as Secretary of State, except insofar as she was dragged for the Benghazi thing. They politicized that. They tried to do that with Joe Biden with the whole Hunter Biden thing, but that sort of blew up in their faces. It ended up turning into an impeachment investigation, not congressional hearings into Joe Biden and Hunter Biden. The other thing is that Jared Kushner right now is looking to be a far bigger scandal than Hunter Biden ever will be. So the whole, like, your son-in-law versus my son, I think it's going to be pretty easy to attack Jared and the Trump family. So, do I think the whole Gamergate, by the way, I see a Tom, I'll show your comment there in the chat. Do I think the whole Gamergate shitstorm had an impact on the 2016 election? I think that demographic doesn't tend to vote that often. They're very loud online. But in terms of a sway or influence, not with a wider voting population, only with a narrow, skewed white or, sort of skewed younger, skewed toward men demographic. But I don't know how many of those people would really ever end up being, kind of a pro-Clinton person anyway. I'm going to have to bring this over so I'm not constantly leaning. And so I don't think that it really did. I think the people who were caught up in Gamergate, they tended to be privileged white guys. And those people tend to vote Republican anyway. They tend to be, more libertarian. It's funny, the more privileges that that your society provides implicitly for you, the more you feel like people shouldn't use government or need government. Those who are most privileged feel like they are the most, liberated and free, and if only everyone could be like them, which is kind of true. That's the whole point of it, is to get more people that kind of extended rights and privileges, just equal it out. Anyway, so getting back to this, so we learned from Clinton in terms of Republican tactics, negativity. I think also it was a big mistake for her to not choose an African-American vice presidential candidate. In truth, I think that was probably a terrible mistake. She tactically decided to try to appeal to rural whites because that's where she was doing poorly compared to Bernie. And she picked Tim Kaine. And like, honestly, what does Tim Kaine bring to the table? Pretty much nothing. So tactically, she didn't excite the African American base, which is what she really should have been more focused on, as opposed to chasing the mythical white rural, guy who's going to come and save the campaign. The misogyny there, looking back now, we realize is probably a big barrier. And and there are two wanderers, the lone wanderer and the lucky wanderer. Everybody's wandering around these days. So, what else? I mean, I don't know that a single presidential visit to Wisconsin would have changed too much, if I'm honest. However, not paying attention to the amount of Russian activity in hindsight, of course. And there were just things that were outside of her control. Events, dear boy, events, like the timing of the Comey comments about reopening an investigation and then taking it back because there was no grounds for it in the first place. So there are a lot of things that we can learn from Clinton's loss. So what can the Bernie people learn from this loss? And I think there are some really important lessons that can be learned. We're going to look here at a Vox article in depth. It's very good. Zach Beauchamp here has done really good work, I think, in bringing together political science. There's some really exciting political science going on in this. And so let's have a look at why Bernie Sanders failed. And part of this is going to be drawing on the knowledge of how he did in 2016 and why he did differently in 2020. I think that's actually an important part of, sorry, my nose, I'm going to just I have handkerchiefs. So I've been using handkerchiefs to save on paper towel or Kleenex and other paper products. When I drink coffee, my nose gets stuffy because it's all warm and cozy. All right. Where was I? I was on, yes, 2016 to 2020. Ultimately, my personal critique of the Bernie Sanders campaign is that it's kind of it goes along with a more general critique I have of modern Marxist movements. Right? So I don't want to put this on Marx, and I don't want to worry about the 20th century Soviet Marxism or whatever. I want to talk more about Marxist critique as we find in the U.S. or even in Europe, to be honest. Here's my thinking on it. I don't know how original it is, but I'm going to open my mouth and let the words come out anyway. So it seems to me that the reason why, if we look at who tends to talk about these issues of worker-based, economic issues, worker-based issues, the need to, I'm trying to change my window a little bit here I'm just going to transition. I'm a little bit bigger now. Who cares about these issues? Who's really pushing them? Class analysis, the people who I see mostly doing class analysis, focusing on class analysis and pushing class analysis. One, they're overwhelmingly white. They are overwhelmingly white. And they tend to skew toward men. I'm not saying that there aren't women out there doing Marxist analysis or people of color or women of color or anything like that. But if you generally look at who is out there pushing these issues, who is out there saying, these are the things that we need to focus on in a society, your chances of saying it's a white guy are really good. And I want to kind of back up a little bit and ask, why is that? And it gets back to the privilege issue. One, there's a socialization issue, I would posit, that men are socialized in our societies to identify themselves through their paid labor. Men, because of the whole provider socialization role when it comes to a more patriarchal definition of what the traditional men's roles should be, provider is really high up there. And so being able to have a job that brings home money so that you can provide and fulfill that social role is much greater on men. men have that burden much higher than women do, because women's burdens are the physical bearing of children and the physical demands of nurturing them and caring for them. And so when class analysis looks at the concerns, they tend to frame it always in terms of paid labor, because that is what a provider is worried about, my paid labor. There's very little analysis done about unpaid labor and unpaid. Engels, to his credit, did talk about the way in which marriage and love and family are co-opted within a capitalist framework to provide unpaid women's labor in the form of maintaining a household at no cost to the capitalist system. It's basically just donated. It's expected through socialization and the creation of future workers. So there is a way to frame women's participation, but it really doesn't connect so much to women's lives. The unpaid labor stuff and the kid stuff does, but the way that a Marxist analysis is framed, it's really framed with the assumption that you're a dude, a provider, in a more patriarchal sense. And also because white people in Western European societies and American societies don't face the kinds of barriers that people of color face, then it's not like a barrier to just get your resume on the table to get into the interview for a white guy, or the systematic, the prison system, in the way that it gives you a record to disadvantage you economically for your entire lifetime, your entire earnings. Right? That is a huge issue within the economic framework, but that's not kind of taken up in a class analysis, because the role of prisons is more based on identity. So you have a gender socialized skew toward men and not problematizing women's issues in a sort of like a binary, sort of aggregate, cis-normative way. And then you also have the fact that white people in America just don't have to deal with as many issues of identity. They might have disability, they might be, like women, there might be other elements on their intersection, but the white part doesn't get in the way. So white guys in particular, who identify themselves through their labor primarily, see the class conflict when they see other white guys, right, making lots of money, and they're not working so hard, but the white guy over here is working hard and he's not making the money. Suddenly this is like about two white guys fighting over resources. And I feel like a lot of Marxist framing assumes that audience. It assumes that you have this provider role that you want to play, and that you have no other real big issues getting in the way of challenging, corporate CEOs for the money that they earn from your labor and claiming that you want it back. I know that I've been going on and on about this, but I think the psychology of it is important, because the psychology of this sort of analysis, assuming a traditional patriarchal outlook, assuming there are no other barriers in terms of identification, identity politics, that get in the way of your Marxist critique, is why I and other people find Bernie's framing quite alienating, because I don't see myself in his revolution. I don't see how the things that I am really concerned about and the ones that I think are important for economic justice fit into this framing of worker. And no, just throwing free childcare at women, and when assuming that free childcare is a woman's issue, free childcare is a family issue, but just throwing these kind of token policies at people who aren't in that group isn't a solution. When Bernie wants to talk about reaching out to black voters, acknowledging the racial wealth gap is not the way that is a way to explain how he is now saying, all right, here's how my theory applies to you, not not trying to meet people where they are. So we're going to look at this article. I'm just going to look, the chat first to see what people are saying. Good morning, Doctor. Good morning, Flint. Coronavirus lockdown would be an opportunity for us to get rid of lice altogether. We just shaved all our hair. I hadn't thought about that, but talk about seeing opportunities where other people don't. That's a really good way to do it. So, to wanderers, peace and love, stay safe. Class analysis is fine, but I think Bernie's supporters were class reductionists. Yes, which is what I think the major problem was. I completely agree. I really do completely agree. I think there is a way to bring that kind of analysis in to be more inclusive. And Matthew in the chat says, what could Bernie have done to avoid alienating you? Primarily is to not always make class the most important thing. Well, there's a couple of things that I found very alienating about Bernie. One is that, as a lifelong Democrat, he just sort of like would join our party, quit our party, join our party, quit our party, join our party, quit our party. And when he, like in 2016, when he lost the primary, he could have stuck around. He could have said, okay, I'm going to stay in the Democratic Party because I want to make it better. And so I'm going to make it better from the inside, and I'm going to, become part of it officially. But he didn't. He's like, no, you're my side B. I'm just going to dump you till I need you again. So that, from an institutional perspective, was alienating. I don't know why the comment about bonies didn't appear. Sorry. And then I did find, basically, whenever I heard him speak, he was always divisive. Bernie was always about confrontation and opposition. So within the class movement, like, he's like, if you're a worker like me, if you're like identify with my group of people who are oppressed, then we're all cool. But we need an enemy. We need to be blaming big banks. We need to be blaming big pharma. We need to be blaming big corporations. And we need to, be blaming big polluters. Like, whatever it was some nameless, faceless conspiracy that was oppressive. And, like, that's not how I think about stuff. When, as an American, I want a president or a party person who can see how we all fit in, see how we all lead. And Bernie's vision of America was always one of confrontation, from what I could tell. It was always about taking something on. And it was very little about giving us a vision of an America where we all were doing better, where we were all there and unified. I don't know if that makes any sense. Hopefully it does. But, all right. When you say Flint is, I'm not sure that Bernie left the Dems so much as Dems left us socialists a long time ago. Well, yeah, but then you're not a Democrat. Like, if you identify as a socialist, what you're doing is you're jumping into a party that is in favor of at least the reform of capitalism, but certainly not overthrowing it. So if your primary focus is the overthrow of capitalism, that is your primary focus. You don't belong in the Democratic Party, you belong in a socialist party. And you can say, oh, well, we don't have a socialist party, so I have to join the Democratic Party. Well, then you don't have to be catered to, because it's not, your party you're joining someone else's agenda already. And you can't just show up and go, okay, now I want to run everything. You have to be part of it. And the Bernie people want to both be part of it and dismiss it and run at the same time. So not you particularly, but I see, for instance, someone like Peter Coffin, or like you say shoe on head, but she doesn't actually have political analysis. On the one hand, they hate the party. They think it's terrible. On the other hand, they want to co-opt it and replace its agenda. And then on the other hand, because I've got 3 hands now, is they feel entitled to be taken seriously. And when you show up at somebody else's house and you tell them their house is a crap hole and that what they need to do is bust out walls and, completely renovate it and completely just reorganize it based on what you like, and then they make you feel unwelcome in your own space, that's not going to go over well. But that's not why Bernie lost. That's not what I want to get onto. But so that framing of, he was really targeting his class rhetoric at people who didn't have to worry about identity issues, who saw themselves primarily as workers. And that's a pretty narrow, not even small business owners, Like, I don't know where small business owners fits when your big fight is against big banks and big corporations. So anyway, let's have a look. Americans are programmed to be terrified of democratic socialism. Yeah, well, so it's almost impossible to fit within the system. Right, well, that's the thing, is that you have to then meet the voters where they are. So you have to put aside your framing and you have to listen to where people are and try to figure out how to appeal to them. And it's not just about like, oh, M for A will fix everybody's problems. So if you're Black, or if you're Latino, or if you're a woman, or if you're in this category, that category, you should support me because M for A is good for all of us. That's basically saying, here's a white person's agenda, and you should just adopt it because, you know, you're going to benefit from it like a white person. But the fact is that there's other inequities that you're not addressing. So the solutions have to connect to the lives of the voters. You can't just sort of show up and go, all power to the workers, when people are like, well, I can't get a job in the first place. Or I'm worried about being fired for, you know, pregnancy discrimination. You know, so there's other things that people value that I don't see as much discussed as much. So anyway, let's get on to the article. I'm just going to totally rip this off. No, I highly, 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 highly recommend that you go and read this. Give Vox some traffic. It's super, super good. And it might not be enjoyable for people who didn't win. But like I said, if you look back at the Clinton loss and where Biden is different this time, learning the lessons, if Bernie's never going to run again, I can't see Bernie, even in 4 years. I don't see it possible that he could make another run for it. But future, like AOC is already doing a better job than Bernie at being inclusive. Already. She's already setting herself apart by, you know, doing controversial things like saying, hey, don't demonize Elizabeth Warren. That minimal amount of unity is still an improvement over the Sanders approach. Like, it's really garbage how, like, alienating it's been. So, you know, you can look at like an AOC as someone who is doing a better job at actually doing the inclusivity. Here we go. Senator Bernie Sanders' theory of victory was simple: an unapologetically socialist politics centering Medicare for all and welfare state expansion would unite the working classes and turn out young people at unprecedented rates, creating a multiracial, multi-generational coalition that could lead Sanders to the Democratic nomination and to the White House. Quote, when we bring millions of working people, people of color, and young people into the political process, there is nothing we cannot accomplish, Sanders wrote in a February 2nd Facebook post. This theory of class politics informed the Sanders strategy from the very beginning of the campaign. The campaign targeted its outreach at low-income and habitual non-voters with the explicit aim of building a new working-class electorate, an approach supported by many of his backers in the media and the academy. I don't know if he means academia. I don't know what he means the academy in there, but anyway. In a 2019 essay in the socialist magazine Jacobin, Princeton professor Matt Karp staked out his case for Sanders on the candidate's ability to win over economically precarious voters by appealing to their common interests. And this is how white men talk. I don't know if Matt Karp is white or not, but this is, I mean, I've known enough white Marxist dudes to hear this kind of, oh yeah, we just need to explain to people why it's in their economic interest to vote against capitalism, and then boom, they'll just be convinced. When it's a super, super hard abstract thing to try to get across, again, and if people have issues about getting shot by a cop on their way to work, or the fact that they can't even get a job, it's a little bit hard to connect with them on their class exploitation. But it's really, really awesome for the privileged people like the white guys who get the jobs and, have to compete against other white guys, as I said before. Anyway, quote, Sanders in 2016 won with more than 13 million votes from a much younger, less affluent, less educated swath of the electorate, Karp writes. The core of Bernie's support comes from voters with far more urgent material interests in the social democratic programs he proposes, and a far clearer position in the class struggle that he has helped bring to the fore. So what is this doing? Yes, it's again associating Bernie's support in 2016 with the idea that people who are less well off materially will be driven by addressing those material interests, which is when you're interested in making money, that is a framing that makes sense. But again, it assumes a lot of privilege to be able to push aside all the other issues like contraception access and abortion access that you need in order to, maintain your family size so you can not have more kids than you can afford, and just focuses on the material side first and foremost. In the end, the author goes on to write, this approach failed. It was former Vice President Joe Biden, not Bernie Sanders, who assembled a multiracial working class coalition in key states like Michigan, where Biden won every single county, regardless of income levels or racial demographics. Sanders had strong support among younger voters, but they did not turn out in overwhelming numbers. At least in some key states, they made up a smaller proportion of the electorate than in 2016. So he was going after people who traditionally don't vote. He lost his rural base. He lost amongst ethnic groups. And the people who did vote for him showed up with a lower rate of frequency than they supported him in 2016. You can't win with that. Sanders' defeat is a hammer blow to the left's class-based theory of winning political power. Yes. Especially given socialist Jeremy Corbyn's crushing losses among the working class in the in the 2019 UK election. There's a really good point coming up here about education. We've moved away from class as a division in how our societies are organized, and we're seeing increasingly that the role of education is determining these things. So people who want to go back to the 1970s and the way we did socialist critique in the 1970s, that's dinosaur thinking. I'm sorry, but if you want to actually win and move forward, you can't say, I want to go back to how things were in the last century, because they're not, and they're never going to be. So what lessons can you learn from previous failures, and where you didn't connect and where you did? Okay. All right. So Sanders had a strategy in shifting the Democratic Party in direction on policy, but the strategy for winning power embraced by his partisans depended on a mythologized and outdated theory of blue-collar political behavior, one that assumes a portion of the electorate is crying out for socialism on the basis of their class interests. Identity, in all its complexities, appears to be far more powerful in shaping voters' behaviors than the material interests given pride of place in Marxist theory. So this is really, really important. There is a reason why in Tennessee and in southern states you have white dudes who actually are union members who are still voting Republican because of their guns. They're voting for their identity issues over their material interests. This is why it's very difficult to get, why I don't think we see, except in maybe some limited cases, a sustained party that is really just focused on these kind of material interests in a Marxist sense. It's very abstract for people who are trying to do their day-to-day lives. You can sit down and try to explain them the whole thing about, well, look, you're working in a mine and, you're getting this much and your boss is getting that much. They kind of get that. I don't want to say voters are stupid or anything, but when it comes to emotive interests, like, well, look, I've got my paycheck and I got my union, but what I'm really worried about is these Democrats going to come take my guns, right? And those kind of emotive, fear-based drivers are very easy to override an intellectual argument. So if you can't compete at the heart level with where people are, it's going to be difficult to get them emotionally connected. And voting ultimately is an emotional process. That's why I don't get I do understand it, but people who are all up in my Dems going, why don't you should vote for the candidate with the best policy. or why don't you vote for Bernie because he's more left of Biden? And when you have an emotional attachment to Bernie, those rationalizations make sense. But most people aren't going out there with a sort of a high-ranked issue of both candidates on policy and putting themselves on a spectrum and doing, Vulcan calculus to figure out whom they should vote for. People have a feel about somebody or a feel about a thing. And those feelings are what drive a lot of voters' decisions. If you ask people if they're happy or angry or scared about the economy, you can do a pretty good job of predicting how they're going to vote. So, yes, material interest critique in Marxist theory isn't necessarily the best way to emotionally connect to a large swath of the voting population. Okay, continuing on. Class conflict doesn't dominate the American political scene, and Sanders' campaign couldn't make it so. Under these conditions, the Sanders campaign looked to the wrong segment of the electorate for salvation. Quote, "The future of Bernie's agenda lies with young people, but college-educated and suburban voters are increasingly interested in the progressive agenda," according to Sean McCluey, I want to say, co-founder of the left-wing polling outfit Data for Progress. Quote, "Sadly, we progressives are about 4 years behind in reaching out to those voters because people don't read enough effing polling data." And I want to say, again, we're going to look at this role of education. I saw people bristling at the idea that Sanders voters are voting because they have some sort of privilege. And I go, oh, look at all these poor people voting for Sanders. Like, well, but if you're poor with a college education, if you're poor and white, you actually have a cognitive advantage, especially where you're, thinking about things on such an abstract level, and so that educational advantage, in order to do the critique and see the wider picture, itself is like a material advantage that you have that other people don't. And to assume everyone has that material, that perspective, where people fall down. Okay, if leftists want to make the leap from influencing the party to running it, they need a new theory of victory. How Sanders' theory failed. The 2016 primary election made the left's theory of the case seem decently plausible. It was driven by misogyny. This is it, mistaking anti-Clinton support and misogyny for class consciousness was a serious flaw, a fundamental flaw of the Sanders campaign. How are we doing for time, by the way? I was drinking. I might have to take a break here in about 2 minutes. All right. Tell you what. This next section is going to be important, and I want to give it proper due, and there's a lot in here. So let's take a break now, because I need one. And I'm running the show. I'm going to top off my coffee. I'm going to stretch my legs a little bit, and we're going to come back and look more closely at where the gaps were. Can I have a cat? Hello, Rory Cats. Meow. Hi, Lonely Wolf. And it's also when people in authority tell you not to vote for someone because they aren't in the part enough or loyal enough to the establishment. You can say what you want, but the fact is the black voters who overwhelmingly turned out for Joe Biden weren't doing it because of an establishment link. I think Democratic voters don't care about the establishment. The whole establishment and the DNC obsession is on the Bernie side because they can't blame the voters for not voting for them. Well, they can't. They want to blame the voters, but they can't because they need to win the voters. So they deflect. But y'all deflect away from responsibility for not appealing to voters, and you try to blame the establishment. And the fact is, people don't have. It's not like people are taking commands from Amy Klobuchar or Pete Buttigieg. Those candidates were failing before Super Tuesday. And when their voters went free, they found the candidate closest to them in political space, which was Biden, not Bernie. So we can talk about the median voter theory. But I get why people want to blame the establishment. But the fact is that it's voters at the end of the day, and especially black voters, who are powerhouses in the Democratic Party. And if you do not, basically blow off black voters at your peril. is what the big lesson that Bernie should have taken away in 2016. It's been just reinforced in 2020. So I'm just gonna, that I don't buy. But now what the patriarchy can't handle K-Winty and Kayla having cats. Oh, I love that. All right, I'm gonna listen. I'm going to give you guys some jazz music to listen to, and come back with a fresh cup of coffee in a few minutes here. So let's bring up that music. Yeah, and we'll talk to you soon. I love that kind of music in the morning, or in the afternoon, as the case may be. Hey, I'm back. Got my fresh cup of coffee in my. It's actually a tea mug. It's very nice, light porcelain. Got from a castle gift shop in Scotland. There's actually two of them, but I smashed one on accident. Anyway, all right, let's get back to this article because Christy's getting all kinds of distracted and taking forever. So let's just focus here. All right, let's get back to how Sanders' theory failed. The 2016 primary made the theory seem plausible enough. Sanders' challenge in 2020 was to hold his ground that he had obtained in 2016, which was with performed well in rural areas and with working class whites and younger voters of all ages. He needed to hold that ground, build his support among non-white blue-collar voters, and increase youth turnout. For the first 3 states, it looked like it might work, especially since his campaign had proved wildly successful with early state Latino communities. And, there were probably some really good natural links, because I know that there's been a lot of work done in terms of union work. When I was growing up, food service workers were not unionized. I'm old as dirt, but that's not usually when I associate unions, I'm associating men-dominated industries, teamsters, plumbers, all of the metal fitters, all the unions, auto workers, very skewed toward men, skewed toward industry, skewed toward routinized work, blue collar kind of things. That's what I can associate with unionization. Miners, things like that. Not underage people, not minors, people who work underground. And food service industry, housekeeping industry, SEIU, those are things that kind of really rose because that was where the future was. And we know in those situations, like housekeepers, housekeeping, retail workers, that is also landscapers. You have certain industries, physical labor, where on the coast especially, you have fewer white people want to take those jobs. Let's just say it that way. Fewer white people want to do hard labor out in the sun, because they lived in whether or not they personally benefit from it, they live in a society where white supremacy exists, and so they can have a slightly more, they have more opportunities because they're not being discriminated against because of their race. So, Latino communities and unionization, I think, is a key in a future area. However, Latinos, Latinx voters, Hispanic voters, Cuban voters, Mexican voters, people from Honduras and Venezuela, they aren't dedicated, reliable Democratic voters. They've actually been closer to the Republican in terms of splits. They've been, more like 60-30, or depending on going back to the Bush administration. Bush did a lot of work in Texas, linking up with the Hispanic community or the Latinx community. And so he did better with those groups. So it is good in a future area, but it's not like shoring up the support of black voters, which is what he kind of needed to do. All right, so, and it proved wildly successful with early state Latino communities. So he won in places that were overwhelmingly white or white plus Latino. Again, that message works when it's a white message working aimed at a white audience. Then came Joe Biden's overwhelming victory in South Carolina, which showed that Sanders' coalition was still weak among one vital constituency, black voters. Shortly after South Carolina was Super Tuesday, where Biden won 10 out of 15 contests and snatched away the white working class and rural supporters that were so vital for Sanders in 2016. So this is what especially like white people like me, the Democratic Party, I have really taken on board in this cycle. Our group, we don't decide who the nominee is. Like, we are a coalition partner, and if in the Democratic Party, you need to listen to black voters. You need, that is where the power lies, and it is not, I don't think, given enough attention or respect or acknowledgement. I don't think, you talk about taking people for granted, and I think that there are definitely some valid critiques there, but going forward, I know for myself, I'm going to be looking to, who are black voters leaning towards, because if you don't have that support in the primary system we have set up, you're just never going to be the nominee. You can't get there with white people in the Democratic Party. You cannot get to the nomination just with white people. This is a big lesson. So in terms of the left and socialism, you guys, if you want to win, you have to start listening to black socialists, and you have to give more framing to the concerns of the people from that community. And if that means that your class analysis actually takes a back seat or is used to augment an identity issue, then that's what you're going to have to do to win. You can't keep selling the same stereotypical white cis straight dudes Marxism and expect other people to buy. White people on the left are going to need to start listening to the rhetoric framed from other class identity positions. So that's a bit of a lesson for me. All right, continuing on. In Minnesota and Oklahoma, 2 Super Tuesday states with large rural white populations, Sanders went from winning nearly all of the counties in 2016 to losing nearly all of them. 538 Jeffrey Skelly found that by April 1st, Biden had won nearly 83% of counties that Sanders had won at some point in 2016. That's not the Democratic establishment doing that. Rural white people don't care what the Democratic establishment in DC think. So this is a lesson that needs to be taken away. We'll go there. Ooh. Okay. Let's see, where do we get? A significant chunk of this reversal, he finds, came as a result of non-college and rural whites flipping from Sanders to Biden in 2020. In the 10 states that voted in March, for which we have both 2016 and 2020 exit polling data, Sanders edged out Clinton with white voters without a college degree in 2016, 54% to 44%. But in 2020, Biden beat Sanders 40% to 33% in those same states. So what can we conclude from this? Well, what we can conclude is that the motivation for supporting a candidate last time around was not purely a Marxist critique one. It was not an economic one. It wasn't, Bernie didn't win these voters over with this great class analysis that people wanted to see a revolution, and mistaking misogyny, basically voting against a woman or, voting against Clinton because you don't like her doesn't mean that people necessarily are embracing your agenda. And mistaking voters who are voting for you as a protest vote from voting for people voting for you as a revolutionary vote was a fundamental error in the Sanders calculation. Like, they thought that they would just run the same playbook in 2020 that they ran in 2016 with a few adjustments, like hire some more staff of color, throw in racial wealth gap there, but ultimately just run the same campaign because they almost won last time. Right? And this time, I think Sanders was thinking, Clinton was just one person to run against, whereas now the moderates are going to be divided. So he counted on moderates not ever unifying, and he only wanted to win a small portion of the party based on the same rhetoric he ran in 2016 instead of trying to widen his base out. But we'll see. All right, it's hard to overstate, going back to the article, it's hard to overstate how central the theory of Sanders' popularity with middle and lower income whites was to his campaign and its outside supporters. They saw his unique touch with voters, not just as a strategy for winning the campaign, but a key reason why socialism as a political project was viable in today's America. Oh, there are people in the rural areas who are just waiting for the socialist revolution, who are just waiting to throw off the shackles of the big corporations. No, they just didn't like Clinton. And you were the only alternative. So, yeah. And when you have when you make conclusions based on bad data, or bad conclusions based on imperfect data, then you're going to just repeat the same mistakes. Quote, as in 2016, Bernie is different from other Democrats in that he knows how to speak to Trump's own voters. Not only does he beat Trump consistently in head-to-head polling, but he offers ordinary people an ambitious social democratic agenda that is designed to deal with their real-world problems, wrote Nathan Robinson in March in the leftist magazine Current Affairs. When Bernie tells working people he is in their corner, they can believe him. White, white, white. White is so white. It's so white. Okay, unquote. The failure of this approach meant that Sanders needed to rely heavily on the second prong of his 2016 coalition. So in other words, working whites just didn't turn out for the socialist revolution. They actually were more anti-establishment than pro-socialist. That makes sense. And now we like anti-establishment, like if you look at Clinton as the traditional candidate and people like saw her as part of the problem, the whole Benghazi thing, right? So if they didn't like Clinton for misogynistic reasons or because the stuff was running up against her or they just didn't like her, Bernie was their alternative. I'm hesitant to ever use the word establishment because people are going to like glom onto that. So anyway. So without being able to count on working class whites, who were very fickle, these are the same people who voted Obama and then Trump and then, maybe Clinton again. So class consciousness is not driving their calculations here. The failure of the white rural approach meant that Sanders needed to, or the white worker approach, rely heavily on the second prong of his 2016 coalition, young voters, turning out in large numbers. Now, this whole idea here is that young people are facing material challenges and, big college debt, and they don't have health care, and driven by these material concerns that override all other things, they're going to vote for Sanders because he's going to be against big pharma and big insurance and big banks, yada, yada, yada. So this, too, is consistent with the socialist theory of victory, which would expect young people who have faced precarious employment and a lower standard of living than their parents would find left politics appealing. The common thing here is that you're looking for people who are economically displaced but completely ignoring their identity and the role it plays in shaping their perception. Quote, the source of Sanders' youth appeal appears to be much the same as it was in 2016. Student loan debt, which of course assumes that you're going to college, or assumes you're going to some sort of associate's degree. All right? So you're screening out people here who don't have the means to actually, who are worried about their primary education first, before they're worried about student debt. Like they have crappy schools already. And so they're not worried about student debt. They're just like worried about, like getting some basic stuff so that people can go and have, student debt later on, get jobs that afford it. So again, it just seems to be skewed toward white middle-class people, right? Student loan debt and escalating health care costs are significant burdens for young people, and incremental solutions seem unequal to the radical challenges they face, Sarah Jones wrote in the New York Magazine in January. With so many candidates competing for votes, a committed, cohesive block of young adults could make a real difference for him in his quest for the nomination, unquote. It's true that young voters from all races and classes tilt heavily in Sanders' direction. The problem is that his campaign couldn't get them to act on his behalf. John Huddock, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute think tank, took a close look at exit poll data on the share of the electorate made up by voters 17 to 29 in 12 early primary states. He found that in all but one of them, which was Iowa, these younger voters made up a smaller share of the electorate than they did in 2016. The numbers decreased by a quarter in Texas, down from 20% of eligible voters to 15%, and about a third in Tennessee, from 15% down to 11%. Quote, even a stagnant percentage between 2016 and 2020 would present a challenge for Mr. Sanders, Haddock writes. A decrease poses a serious challenge to the very premise of his campaign. I don't know if you guys accept all this. I think these are all just generally totally legit points. And then most of them are just observations based on data. So what happened? Why? So next section. I hate to say it, really do hope Warren has to step in. I'm not quite sure. So we had Warren as VP, Biden quit. The thing is that Warren did even worse than Sanders. So why would you pick Warren? I mean, she was a failure relative to Biden and Sanders. So you're putting up an even weaker candidate than either of the top two you have choose against Trump. And I guess if you put it in what candidate do I want at the top of the ticket, Flynn, then yeah, you can have those conversations. But what candidate can beat Donald Trump? Then Warren is not the answer there. I also don't think Biden, by the way, should pick Warren. I don't think he will pick Warren as VP. One is she's as old as he is. And being as old as he is, he already said he wanted someone from the younger generation to come up behind him in one of his speeches. And I think that's the case. Given his age, he needs to signal sort of a passing of the torch and setting somebody up. So I don't think he's going to pick Warren for that reason. The second reason I don't think he's going to pick Warren is because she doesn't unify the progressive side of the party. Let's face it, a lot of Bernie people hate Warren with a dying passion, like a consuming passion. They think she's a traitor, and they point to the fact that she didn't endorse Sanders. Like, if he picked Warren, it would just give some Bernie people more stuff to complain about. So there's no point in picking Warren on that score. And then the next thing is that she doesn't bring anyone to the table demographically that Biden doesn't already have. Warren's big sell was with women like me, college-educated white women in the suburbs and urban areas, maybe a little bit out in the rural areas. But it's a very elite sort of privileged group that she was appealing to. And I'm not saying that other women didn't support her, but that's kind of where her strengths were. Biden already cleaned up with suburban women. So what does she bring to the table? Nothing. I think it is inevitable that Biden will pick a person of color, a woman of color. If he doesn't, like I said, I would be furious. And that should be his way of, acknowledging that the Black community lifted him up. The Black community put him where he is. And there's just no way to say that. And therefore, he needs to acknowledge and honor that by lifting up somebody from the Black community and putting them on a path to success, the way that the Black community put Joe Biden on the path to success. And this was Hillary's mistake. This was, I think, looking back, we really shouldn't underestimate the lack of enthusiasm in the African American community, or the Black community, to turn out to vote for Clinton. Could have been modified a little bit with a more tactical, more representation, more promoting the party, the heart of the party, back to the party. Yeah. So, okay. Dude, Warren supporter. Yeah, that's fine. But I'm saying if you look at Warren's support in the aggregate, I'm not saying every single Warren supporter, by the way, was a woman. I'm saying that where Warren did well, what she could bring to the table is white suburban types, women. So, yeah, I'm not saying that Warren couldn't appeal to men, but just the way that Sanders sort of skews toward, I think, more men in terms of support, Warren was doing really well with women who were college educated and white and in suburban women. So, would increasing Black turnout help Biden in any swing states? Yeah. Milwaukee, Michigan, Ohio, Virginia, Florida. Yeah, all of those. Oh, okay, you were joking. Okay, I was like, I know. All right. Well, okay, thank you for telling me you were joking, the lucky wonder. All right, back to the article. Why did Sanders' theory fail? So what happened? Why didn't the political revolution show up? This is the sort of thing that political scientists and Democratic activists are going to be examining for years, but there are at least 3 big conclusions that we can draw seemingly well-supported, that seem relatively well-supported by polling and research. The first is that Sanders' theory rested in part on a Marxist-inflected theory of how people think about politics, or I would say how they think people should think about politics. A basic premise of Marxist political strategy is that people should behave according to their material self-interest as assessed by Marxists, which is to say their class interests. That's where I get back into emotions, right? If people are supposed to act in their material self-interest and you give some guys in Tennessee, like, here's your gun constitutional rights self-interest and here's your negotiating a 4% pay rise over the next 2 years as opposed to 3, you're putting these, you would think from Marxist perspective, people would care more about their pocketbooks, but that's not always the case. Proposing policies like Medicare for All, which would plausibly alleviate the suffering of the working classes, should be effective at galvanizing working class voters to turn out for left parties. But this isn't really how politics works, at least in the contemporary United States. And there was a point I wanted to make, too, about, the 1970s compared to today, and just, unionization back in the day, in the middle part of the century, where it was dominated by white men and white men's blue-collar work, and women were just trying to get basic equality. And early on in the unions, they weren't actually the most friendly to those kinds of proposals. That's changed over time. But, it's not like Marxism has always been really welcoming to women's issues. and Marxist feminists had to develop their own line of thinking in order to fill the absence of those kinds of critiques of capitalism within Marxism, because it would always come at from a sort of cis man perspective. Anyway, I'm getting off the topic now. Right, political scientists have found that as a general rule, the specifics of policy positions and campaign rhetoric play little role in mobilizing turnout for a campaign. Right? Let me say this again. The specifics of policy positions and campaign rhetoric play little role in mobilizing turnout for a campaign. And this is why when the burners, turn up in my mention saying, oh my gosh, name one policy that Sanders is better than Biden on. The point, you're missing the point. That's not how people go about. I mean, especially for people, if you go to college and you're taught by other people here's a whole complicated framework of how to see the world. And then you go out in the world, you're like, oh my gosh, I see this framework everywhere. I can understand where you got this. That doesn't mean that you can just turn around to the next person and say, vote the way I do because of my policies make more sense for us. Because I have this innate knowledge, or not innate, but I have this acquired knowledge that makes me see things in a way that you can't. Therefore, I'm superior. My positions are superior to yours. No, that's not a really good way to connect with people. No matter how many times Sanders repeated his passionate defense of universal health care, no matter how often his volunteers went door to door arguing for social democratic policies, the content of the policy messages wasn't going to convince young people and economically disaffected voters to show up in a way that he needed. Quote, most of the field experiments I've seen, the published work in political science, as well as the internal tests within the progressive community, shows that talking about policies and issues does not really spur turnout, says John Sides, a political scientist at Vanderbilt University. And I want to look at the way that we can maybe look at the way that Obama connected in 2008 compared to the way that Bernie is. But all right. Second, it seemed okay. Actually, since that's how they're going to do it, let's actually have that conversation. When Obama was doing his community organizing, the community organizing approach I was taught from when I was at university and how to get people interested and engaged was that you went door to door and you listened to them and what their concerns were, and then you connected their concerns to a policy prescription somewhere out here, right? So if people came at you with, I've got issues of my healthcare is too expensive, right? And Obama people would be like, oh, we want to do universal healthcare. We want to have, everyone have access to healthcare. We're going to do it. They didn't know it was going to be Obamacare at the time, but they had a plan for that. Or if it was issues of racial discrimination, or if it was problems with whatever else, right? You're taking people where they are, you're connecting them. But with the Bernie people, they want to sell you on their policy. It's always M for A. M for A, M for A. And I'm not saying that that's not important, but when you try to define the political agenda and then say, okay, voters, this is how, you have to fit into my political agenda as opposed to the other way, you can see there were people who didn't have that connection with M for A. You're automatically kind of excluding them as potential voters. Whereas Obama would have found ways of grassroots connecting suburban voters and rural whites and voters of color around the country with a range of policies. All right. So talking about policies and issues, you kind of have to start again with the emotion and connect there, as opposed to going, hey, we have, let me sell you this M for A plan and I'll tell you how it works for you. It's kind of like being sold insurance or a car or anything else. It's brought to you as opposed to organically coming up from you. All right, second, it seems that Sanders and his campaign had assumed his popularity with the white working class in 2016 was about him and his policies, when in fact it wasn't. The white working class voters that Sanders won were mostly anti-Clinton voters, McLuey tells me. And this is important. This is exciting. Regression analysis. A regression analysis. So in a regression analysis, it is a multivariate model. Instead of just saying here's party ID and by men and women, here's two independent variables, your party ID and the gender with which you identify, and we're going to put your party ID on the distribution of your gender identification. We're going to look to see if there are patterns there. But you can't really say anything causal about that because you're just looking at the distribution of patterns. With a regression analysis, you actually try to estimate different factors that allow you a more precise prediction of a person's individual score. So you might put in their gender identity, the state that they live in, their income, their education, their party identification, for instance, and then you try to use all of those independent factors. Like if you have 5 factors, you get 5 different values that tell you the strength that each one contributes to predicting how a person will vote. So regression analysis is a way to show discretely, like, okay, your gender identity can explain this much, your party identification explains this much of your vote, your income, if we know your income, we're able to do a better job of, like, with 10% of getting who you're going to vote for right. It's the most powerful way we have to actually determine causality. So a regression analysis by 538's Nate Silver finds support for this theory that mostly they were anti-Clinton voters. Silver's data showed that Clinton's skeptical Bernie supporters in 2016 were not progressives who opposed Clinton from the left, but they were moderate or conservative Democrats who tended to have right-leaning views on racial issues and were more likely to support repealing Obamacare. Those never Hillary voters also tended to be rural, lower class, and white. For some of these voters, Sanders may have been a protest vote against a woman closely associated with progressive social causes, when the alternative was Joe Biden, a male Democrat with working class appeal who was widely perceived as a moderate. They seem to have preferred him over the Vermont socialist. So when the choice here was, a more conservative Democrat and a guy, not a woman, those people went to their they went to someone closer in political space than they were. So rather than voting a protest vote against Clinton, they're like, actually, you know what? Joe Biden doesn't scare me. Joe Biden, he might not be perfect, but I can see him doing a good job. He sounds like me. When you talk about why people vote and having a rural, white voter who hears Joe Biden and hears someone who sounds like his neighbor, and I know people, well-educated coastal whites and elites, on Twitter who are opinion informers, they might want to say something like, Joe Biden, he doesn't sound very articulate and he stumbles over his word. So do those rural white people. They know the sound of someone at a Friday fish fry, and Joe Biden sounds like that, so they're comfortable with him. All right. Third, the Sanders socialist theory rested on a misunderstanding of the way identity works in contemporary American politics. Ding, 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 ding. Americans do not primarily vote as a member of an economic class, but rather as a member of a party and an identity group. Think about all of the white evangelical Christians who think of themselves as a Christian first and American second. Right? When you ask me what my identity is, the first thing that's going to come to mind for me is that I'm a woman. I'm a white woman. It's not that I'm a worker. My world is shaped first by, one, opening doors for me because of my skin color, right? And then next, I am primarily defined through my gender identity, which is a woman. And so, if you think of yourself as a worker first, it means all those other identities you don't have to think about. And that's where I think the gap is sometimes why maybe people like Vosh don't understand why it's so alienating to be edgy. And that all you're doing is making your socialist revolution an exclusive safe space for shitty white guys and for shitty people who identify with the kind of values that shitty white guy identifies with. So, not having to think about your identity in order to focus solely on how you can get more money for your work is a real point of privilege that I don't know that people always see. You're an a-hole? Okay. All right. Trump won the overwhelming bulk of Republican voters in the 2016 general election despite taking heterodox positions on a number of policy issues simply because he had an R next to his name. His message resonated with working class whites, but not working class people of color, because it centered ethnic grievance and conflict. This created a big problem for Sanders. His refusal to formally become a Democrat and harsh attacks on the Democratic establishment were much less likely to resonate with voters strongly attached to the Democratic Party, and the effect seems to have hurt him badly. I can agree with this. And when you're not a member of a party for most of your life, it's hard, I think, to understand the motivation. As someone who does identify, I can tell you, from the inside, someone who identifies as a Democrat, I do see the world in sort of like there's Democrats and there's Republicans in terms of political power. And then there's the people who don't vote. And then there's swing voters or whatever else. But having a D besides your name is a heuristic for me. That if you are a Democrat, I know you ascribe to a certain set of values. And in a choice, even if I know nothing else about the candidates, I'm going to vote for the Democrat over the Republican because I know as a package, I'm much closer to the Democratic policies than the Republican ones. And people who are associated with the party, especially like if you're not part of those anti-party establishments, but like Nancy Pelosi, a lot of people like Nancy Pelosi. You couldn't tell from Twitter, parts of Twitter, I'm sure. But there are a lot of Americans who do admire the work that she's doing and do kind of feel a rally effect around her. And so, and also expect party people to come together. Like one of the things that angered Democrats last time was how long it took Bernie to actually endorse Clinton, and then really not believing that he was that about it. It seemed more pro forma. And people are going to point to like, oh, Bernie this, Bernie that. But he didn't sell it. He didn't sell it. And it's the same thing now here. Like when we don't want to see our nominees fight inside the party all the way through November. The whole point is, we all know we have to compromise, and then we come together to fight Trump. And Bernie has always stood outside of that. He's always kind of been aloof to that wider goal because he's not a member of the party. And his demonization of the Democratic establishment, I felt attacked by it. I'm not going to lie. When he talks about the Democratic establishment, I think of Nancy Pelosi and Adam Schiff and Chuck Schumer, who are out there doing stuff for workers, who organized, who ran the impeachment stuff. So he doesn't win me over as a leader of the party when he can't get along with the most influential people in it. Anyway, so the Super Tuesday exit poll showed Biden beating Sanders among self-identified Democrats by 30 percentage points in both Virginia and North Carolina, about 25% or 25 points in Oklahoma, 20 points in Tennessee, and nearly 50 points in Alabama. So I know probably for a lot of burners, it makes you feel good to crap on the Democratic establishment. Oh, you're so pure. You're not part of the establishment, man. But all you're doing is alienating voters. So, do you want to win these people over, or do you want to be right? You can find a way to be both, but not the way you're doing it right now. Partisanship seems to be particularly important in Sanders' inability to make inroads among Black Democrats, especially older ones. In their new book, Steadfast Democrats, political scientists Cheryl Laird and Ismail White find that Black political identity in the United States centers on affiliation with the Democratic Party, which is understood among African Americans as a vital part of being committed to racial progress and in-group solidarity. While a significant share of Black voters have conservative views on policy issues, overall, they are overwhelmingly committed to the Democratic Party as an institution. So when you crap on that institution, people are going to take it personally. And it makes it harder for them to trust you as a leader when you're crapping on them. You can't have a multiracial working class coalition, the author of this article goes on to write, without significant support among Black Americans. And Sanders' team recognized this and worked hard to court Black voters, but it seems that Sanders' insurgent identity, his explicit decision to run as an outsider against something in order to appeal to habitual non-voters, may have doomed him with this vital constituency of people who do vote. So again, it's that, you can fault for Joe Biden for a lot of things, but when I hear Joe Biden speak, he paints a picture in words of an America that I want to live in and other people want to live in. And again, when Bernie Sanders speaks, he paints a picture of disruption and conflict and confrontation and taking power and revolution. And if that's where you're at, cool. But if you have to ask, why not beyond that? How do you offer revolution in a way that doesn't make people feel alienated? Because if your revolution is also against the political party, then you're going to alienate the people who identify. So there is no demographic miracle for the left. There used to be a time when this kind of class identity, I'm going to put here, politics, was quite powerful, both in the United States and especially in Europe for much of the 20th century. One's class was a powerful predictor of who one was likely to vote across the Western world. Right? And when you look at European class socialism, it has grown up or has developed being centered around white men. White men fighting other white men over how much money each of the white men get. And meanwhile, women were outside the house. Women were pushed out of the factories and back into the house to make room for the white men so the white men could come back into the factories and start fighting other white men about who gets what kind of money. Right. And then also you have that link to turnout, because in the UK, and initially in the 1950s, like how when women were economically dependent on men, they didn't have legal economic autonomy or divorce rights. There was an influence. The gender gap between how men and women voted has grown over time, and it's directly linked to women's economic autonomy. I think that's the best predictor of whether or not a woman, well, now it's a marriage gap, which is kind of another economic vulnerability measure. But women, there was a link between how a husband would vote and that's how his wife was expected to vote. That's changed over time. But in those situations, if you had a union household or you could kind of forget about women's issues and just assume the household would vote in the provider's interest. And that's just not how things work anymore. So they go on to write, yet this changed in recent decades. The Alford Index, a metric political scientists use to measure the role of class in voting patterns, has been in decline across Western democracies. The working class is no longer overwhelmingly likely to support left-wing parties. The upper classes no longer joined by their support for right-leaning ones. Instead, and this is so important, ding, 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 pay attention. So if you want to know how to win the fights of the 21st century, you don't run the class rhetoric of the 20th. Instead, class divisions have been replaced by educational divides. Highly educated, high-income voters have tended to defect to center-left parties. White-collar people and, these types who are supposed to be the enemy are actually now more on the progressive side. Think doctors, I don't know what that means, while non-college, low-income voters have defected to the right. Think about the Brexit movement in the UK. Education was a huge way to predict, was a huge impact or factor in determining. The more education you had, the more likely you were to sort of be in favor of cosmopolitanism and European integration. And the more, the less education you had, the more sort of isolationist, wanting to protect your domestic interests and your culture against that kind of cosmopolitanism was the point of interest. So this reflects the fact that debates over social issues like immigration and gender roles, rather than issues of material redistribution, are the primary cleavages dividing Western publics. Attitudes surrounding tolerance and diversity, not redistribution, are the clearest predictors of which kind of party you're interested in supporting nowadays. The dominant theory among Sanders and his left-wing supporters is that Democrats and other center-left parties like Britain's Labour Party allowed this to happen by embracing more market-friendly politics under leaders like Bill Clinton and Tony Blair. Sanders' rejection of this neoliberal approach should have been able to reverse the trend and bring back working-class voters Democrats had previously left behind. Quote, Sanders points to an alternative future of class politics, politics itself, writes Karp, the Princeton professor. He continues, oh God, these, again, just Karp comes across as a typical out-of-touch white guy who wants to speak for the classes because they're so self-enlightened without actually spending time talking to working-class people. His support of Medicare for all is not a pledge to find the best policy framework, but a vow to fight the insurance industry until every American has health care as a human right. This is the kind of class politics that has won Sanders the support of 1 million small donors faster than any candidate in history. This is just what is required to challenge the power of the ultra-rich, a politics that does not treat lower-income voters as a kind of passive supplement for professional liberals, but one that can put the new working class itself at the center of the action. The thing is that they are just associating people and treating them as means to the end here, the class consciousness, and using the working class, in their goal of overthrowing the ultra-rich as instrumentally as any other sort of like approach about workers. I'm not going to try to adjudicate whether the underlying theory, the author of the article writes, that neoliberalism caused the decline in class voting is correct. There are other plausible explanations. Instead, I just want to point out that the logic doesn't quite work. Quote, it might be true that the right-wing shift by left-wing parties caused this realignment, but it doesn't mean that if they shift back, they can undo it, says Sophie Hill, a Harvard PhD student who studies the politics of redistribution. Quote, that assumption of symmetry we make is never very plausible, unquote. Decades of politics centering identity issues like race and partisanship can't be reversed by a socialist bursting onto the scene. And I want to just say, so I've lived through probably, quite a few elections. It is astonishing to me the way that Bernie has actually managed to erase, by throwing out Medicaid for all as the only issue that matters. I see a lot of erasure of issues, like women's issues, like dealing with the burdens of childcare, like issues of choice, like gun violence, and not just the racial wealth gap, but like the systematic issue of why Black Lives Matter exists in the first place to deal with things like racial problems in policing that's based on, preserving a sort of white form of power, exploiting communities through all that kind of stuff, and voting rights. Right. All of that stuff it is, in my perception, seen as not important. It's legitimately put as a second, all of those things. Like, if we can just sort out your health care, it doesn't kind of matter about child care. If we just sort out your health care, we don't have to worry about the legality of abortion. Those things will just shut up about those women or people who care about reproductive access, and non-binary people, and others who want reproductive care. Like, we'll get to you. But first we have to have our class revolution. Anyway. So we saw this not only in the United States, but also in Britain's 2019 election. Jeremy Corbyn, an avowed socialist well to the Sanders left, worked as hard as he could to win back Labour's traditional base, white working class voters. Corbyn's policies actually polled decently well, but it wasn't enough to overcome the politics of xenophobia and nationalist grievance that powered the Brexit vote. If you think of Brexit like the Second Amendment right, you can do kind of a policy equivalent. People are willing to vote against their material interests in terms of voting against their union in order to keep their guns, even if they know that they might take a hit in the short term because of that emotional attachment. And the same with the idea of the illusion of having control over Britain's borders and control over migration. People were willing to vote against their class interest in order to be driven, to secure that sort of false sense of border control. In seats with high shares of people in low-skilled jobs, The conservative vote share actually increased by an average of 6 percentage points, and Labor's share fell by 14 in seats with the lowest share of skilled jobs. The Tory vote share fell by 4 points, and Labor's fell by 7. It probably went to the Lib Dems. The UK's Financial Times wrote in a post-election analysis, the swing of working class areas from Labour to Conservative had the strongest statistical association explored by the FT. So the swing of working class people, you can't just appeal to, say, class unity and think that that's going to be enough, because that's not how people think about, that's not how their value systems are structured. They're not worried about the abstract notion of material redistribution, of, the profits that are, gained from labor. And even framing it in that way excludes a lot of women's labor. It really is, that whole working class framework assumes an employer and a job, and in a way that really tends to frame it in terms of like more of a traditional men's framework, and excludes a lot of women. The problem is a theory of change that assumes the outcome it's aiming for. The goal of socialist politics is to reactivate the working class as a political force, but a sweeping wave in a national primary or a general election is a really tough place to do that. Socialist rhetoric and policy platforms aren't enough to change the deep logics that guide the way voters think about the world, which centers on identity issues like partisanship. I would put in less for gender, although it's sort of an experience we all have, ethnicity, and immigration. I just want to put a big box around this, because again, if your emotions are tied to certain policy outcomes, you make the argument that your policies are better, but you're not doing it from a place of reason any more than someone who says, look, I just want a Democrat to win. You can't pull a I'm more rational than you are card in that situation. You're just rationalizing your policy preference. And people who want to see Biden win are doing it as a policy preference. Right? They think they're like, my calculation is Biden is better than Trump, and so I have to vote for Biden, doesn't matter what his policies are. And you go, oh, that's brainless. Like, well, no, tactically that makes perfect sense based on what my preferred outcome is. If your preferred outcome is revolution, well then yeah, Bernie Sanders is your candidate. If your preferred outcome is Trump out of office and any sane Democrat, then, the candidate who can win the most votes is the person that you want in place. That's Joe Biden right now. He's getting the most. So the problem is, oh yes, you can see this problem at work in some of America's data on white working class ideology. A new survey of all white voters by YouGov, not all white voters, but all the voters in the sample were white, on behalf of Data for Progress, asked voters a battery of questions about their view of government and economic policy. Now remember, whites are the most privileged group in the country, so they should have the fewest barriers when it comes to racial discrimination that they're aware of. You're probably going to get, a good amount of gender discrimination there, because if you've got whites, you're going to have white men and women. But other kinds of nexes of concerns that intersect for other groups more prominently and noticeably should be gone. White people just see their own material self-interest throughout the other lenses. Right. So, for example, YouGov's pollsters. Yes. Okay. Whites. Okay. We're sorry. Asked voters a battery of questions about their view of government and economic policy. Whites who fit the Sanders 2016 coalition profile, non-college, rural, low income, were consistently less likely to express support. My language is falling apart, for social democratic ideas. So hold on a second. I thought I was going to have an explosive belch, but it's just sitting in my tummy being uncomfortable. And this is a challenge of Marxist revolution, is the people who most benefit from it are the ones who are more skeptical about it. Again, the people who fit the Sanders coalition profile, non-college, rural, low-income whites, were also the least likely, or consistently less likely, to support social democratic ideas. For example, YouGov pollsters asked respondents whether government had gotten bigger because the problems we face have gotten bigger, or government had gotten involved in things that people should do for themselves. College-educated whites, people who understand who've been had the advantage of an educational process that taught them how structures work, and that people don't always have control over their lives, but structures sometimes determine these kinds of things. Those college-educated whites picked the former. The government has gotten bigger because problems have gotten bigger, 53% to 47%. While non-college whites said the opposite was true, that people should do things for themselves by 41 to 59% margin. Similarly, voters who were asked what they believe was closer to the views, the less government does, the better, or there are more things that government should be doing, by a 58 to 42% margin, rural voters opted for the former of the latter, that there are fewer things the government should be doing. So if this is people's viewpoint and you come at them saying we need to eliminate all private insurance in order to have a one-size-fits-all healthcare problem, and they look at you like, no, this is why. And it's not because they're stupid. And it's not because they are slaves to the Democratic establishment. It's that the Sanders movement fundamentally misunderstands where people are coming from when it comes to their political internal compasses. The YouGov data most likely reflect the fact that a significant chunk of rural and non-college educated whites in the Trump area are Republican voters, which is true, which is the point. Partisan identification overrides and swamps class identity, causing them to think about the world less as members of a class who could benefit from state intervention and more as members of a party or as individuals against government that's generally skeptical of the welfare state. That's not to say it's impossible to imagine the left breaking the current partisan system and winning back the white working class majority in the long run. There are concrete policy changes in the United States like automatic voter registration, strengthening union by repealing right-to-work laws, which we need to get on, definitely need to get on that, might help increase younger voter turnout and bring the working class home. But these initiatives can only be enacted after winning elections, not before. In the short run, it means working with the electorate as it actually exists, rather than the one you hope to create. The YouGov data for Progress Poll found surprisingly high levels of support for certain progressive priorities and policies, like a wealth tax, among suburban whites, who had in the past favored Republicans. This suggests that progressives need to figure out a way to galvanize this group for their candidates, rather than try to build a 20th century style working class movement from scratch. Quote, large shares of suburban whites agree the government should be bigger, and almost all support at least a moderate amount of regulation. John Ray, a senior political analyst at YouGov, tells me, quote, both sides need suburban whites to win. Both sides have a chance to win them, and both sides will be fighting tooth and nail for them in November and beyond, unquote. Political campaigning and politics of mass electorate movements can be intoxicating, but it seems to have blinded the left as to how weak their structural position is in American politics. And, my European friends are like, I want to just, my way, I want to support the person who's the farthest to the left in an American campaign, and that's how I want to see progress made. You really don't get how American politics works. Because that, just read this article, but you don't win on the left by picking the candidate most likely to alienate the widest number of voters. That's not how you win on the left. On the left in America, because first past the post and the Electoral College and a whole lot of other things, people can hate me. Don't hate the player, hate the game. All right? We have a structure in which you have to appeal to the median voter. And the median voter generally doesn't want revolution. They want stability. They want maybe progressive change over time, but they don't want revolution. And so as long as you are in that position where you're trying to sell people on maybe not violent revolution, but serious disruption, if you're not following, you're trying to lead, don't expect that many people to come up behind you. And yes, you have to acknowledge the way that women view the world as women and our concerns. And you can't just say, here's a bunch of working class kind of like traditionally male concerns, men's concerns, and you should adopt these because we'll all benefit if you take my worldview. It's not the connection. So one is not really taking on board identity politics, rather whether it's really talking to all kinds of women about issues that affect us without framing it in a Marxist way. Connecting with Black voters and understanding, again, how to talk about policy solutions to Black voters that doesn't frame it in terms of a revolution or economic material interests all the time. And, also just, throwing out phrases like the corrupt racist justice system or the racial wealth gap is not enough. Attacking the Democratic Party will alienate you from Democratic voters who identify with that party. So there's a lot of mistakes that the Sanders campaign made. Part of it was misinterpreting the results of 2016. Parts of it was an unwillingness of the candidate, an inflexibility on Bernie's part to be anything other than what he is. He was going to win. He wanted to win on his terms. He wanted to win the party not by bringing in more people. He ran a 30% of the voter base strategy with the idea of I just need to get a plurality and then I will crush and dominate and other people will have to grovel to me. And he's literally never made any effort to make people in the Democratic Party feel like he is on our side. All he does is try to demonize the party, and we see his followers demonizing the party completely inappropriately. I see the DNC get blamed for the craziest stuff that happens in Wisconsin that's the fault of Republicans. Sanders supporters are trying to pin on the DNC. How are you supposed to lead I don't trust him. Yeah. So there's a lot of things that Bernie got wrong, a lot of reasons why his campaign made fundamental miscalculations that cost them the election. And the failure of the Sanders campaign cannot be laid at the feet of the DNC or other Democratic candidates. Ultimately, you either win enough voters over to support you or you don't. And voters are not idiots, especially not Black voters. They are not stupid. They're treated like low information voters who don't have their own class consciousness, false consciousness, all kinds of crap, patronizing stuff I've seen. And you're never gonna do well if you're too arrogant to think that you need to listen to the people whose votes you need. So I know how American politics work. It doesn't. It's an imperfect system like every system. There's a lot of problems with it. There's also, I think, a lot of potential as well. You could literally, I can't think of a perfect political system. And we're human beings. We always have crap. Is there a spectrum? Class reductionism is one extreme, pure identity politics on the other. The average voter is probably a median. I think, honestly, you're not going to like it. Maybe it depends on what your opinion on Obama is, but I think Obama did a good mix. I think Obama did a very good mix because he is, when Obama got up to talk about being a Christian and it was about addressing the fact that he was a Black man. And being up there and being an embodiment of a new type of politician who we hadn't seen in that space for a political president, for a candidate. Barack Obama can't divorce. He has his identity, his racial or his ethnic background is obviously a part of his identity. And when Obama spoke, I believed him on healthcare, but I didn't feel like healthcare was really a way to undermine capitalism. It feels like there's a lot of things that Bernie talks about where he's just harnessing a talking point to get to the thing that he really cares about, which is class revolution. Whereas when Obama talked about fixing people's problems, and he was coming at it from a community organizer point of view, a grassroots point of view, he wasn't coming at it from an academic theory of this is how we always need to look at Marxism first as a way to figure out how to solve this problem. And I felt more like, as a community organizer, he was looking at local solutions or local, drawing things out of people bringing them together with a common goal that unifies us, not divides us. So I do think that there is a way to include class analysis into left politics. I just think that you can't do it at the expense of identity politics. And again, I would point to AOC as a person who I think is far more effective than Bernie is in terms of understanding you don't crap where you eat. So when you have a woman who's a progressive like Warren, you don't drag her for every little thing she does. You know, you understand that your allies aren't always going to be 100% fealty, loyalty, subject to your whims. They have their own identities, they have their own concerns, they have their own problems. And the question is, where can you create the allies? Where can you create connections? And I see her doing a far better job. And maybe that's because she doesn't come from, you know, the same background of Bernie growing, aging in a labor movement that was really centered on white men's concerns in the 1960s and the 1970s and the 1980s. She's a different generation. The intersectional approach is how you bridge this. Yeah, I agree. And you can't, and you have to let different identities take center stage at different points of view. As I said, I felt like the only way I would ever really hear Bernie talk about contraception and abortion access is if we framed it in terms of women's ability to, like, you know, go to work. You need to let other forms of identity take center stage. And then you can allow other people to identify with you through that identity politics. The intersectional approach also teaches people they fall under several labels and therefore, and how they interact exactly. Dems seem to have similar issues to the Labour Party. No, I don't think the Democrats have similar issues to the Labour Party. I think Bernie's faction. So, to remember that really when it comes to, you know, Congress, Black Americans are very important in Congress. And I know that in terms of leadership, you know, you see Nancy Pelosi a lot, but there's a lot of really high-ranking senior African American and Black and people of color generally, but especially because of the commitment to the party and the long-term connections, you see a real swath, you know, like quite a lot of representation from the Black community. And that is not like the Labour Party. It's just not. And you know, the Labour Party is still, there's a lot of that kind of, well, I mean, it's been changing, and I don't want to characterize it in a simplistic way, so let me roll that back. I think identity politics is far more defining in the American Democratic Party than it is in the Labour Party, because there's simply fewer places of where those nexes have come into conflict, because you don't have a critical mass of a constituency that can swing elections. So and when it comes to Afro-Caribbean British citizens, they exist. There's, you know, maybe there's a lot of centralization in London and stuff, but they don't have the sort of power to determine the outcome of an election by collectively voting, the way that Black Americans have a huge influence on the Democratic Party when they kind of get behind a candidate. And so it's still, like, people in the Labour Party in the UK are like, racism is bad. But it's not a civil rights issue that is something the party spends a lot of time on. You know, it's still majority white. So I don't think you can really look, I mean, the other thing too is that Bernie was just like super, super white. I know that they've got, within younger people, he's got some diversity, but the whiteness of his older voters and supporters just, again, is a disconnect. So, but there are, when it comes to the Labour Party challenge, then in terms of the goals of it, where we want to see more equity, including economic equity, in that way that they have similarities. Labour lost Scotland under Tony Blair, and the Dems lost too many local seats during Obama. No, Dems, well, I mean, the Dems, okay, so Emma, one, Labour lost Scotland under Tony Blair. Yes, no, I mean, the SNP really didn't swing until, well, I mean, there was an alienation there. That Tony Blair was a bit too centrist, and a lot of people found the SNP as a good alternative. But that actual sweep was started, the actual effects of it, I think, happened a little bit later on. And when the Dems lost too many local seats during Obama, that was a direct reaction to Obama and the Dems instituting Obamacare. So, when you want to say Tony Blair became more centrist to appeal to people in England, in order to win the election, yeah, I think you've got a point there. And there are some people, and did people in Scotland move, were they already farther left than the English Labour were anyway? Yes. So when the SNP, and you're also leaving out the role of the referendum in terms of unifying people around the SNP. So, I mean, you can't really do, I think, a direct comparison saying somehow centrism killed off Labour and killed off the Democrats. The fact is that the Obama won with a majority from the Democrats in 2008, and then they enacted a very, very progressive policy, and there was a massive counter-revolution. There was a massive counter-reaction or, blowback on that, and it galvanized the Tea Party, and they were a push against that. So I think the reason why you look at 2010, it was because the Democrats committed to their left agenda, that they lost seats to, in the middle of the country. So it's not because Obama wasn't far enough left that the Tea Party rose. It's because they were a little bit farther than center right that you saw a huge counter reaction. In Scotland, the Scottish National Party is very progressive, even more than Labour. Yep, I would agree with that. However, it's the Labour Party's in a terrible position, I think. The Conservatives don't really, they have enough of a base in England and now in Wales that they don't really have to worry about winning Scottish votes. And it's nice when it comes over, but it's not like that's a real problem for them to maintain power. Whereas English people on the left are not quite as left as Scottish people on the left. And Labour's been losing credibility in Wales. So you've got real problems with the left parties in the UK. You actually have the problem of people will vote for SNP instead of Labour. They're not forced to vote for Labour because it's the leftmost choice, which means the left is actually more divided into different parties. They divide themselves by party and allow the Conservatives who, you have UKIP, but UKIP wasn't even running in certain parts of the country because it's a United Kingdom, I guess, Independence Party, but they weren't quite the alternative the SNP were. So what you have is basically two parties on the right, Conservatives and UKIP. I'm not going to even count BNP or the English, whatever, the other far right parties. But on the left, and then you got Liberal Democrats who are kind of weird. Like they can be counter to Conservatives traditionally or counter to Labour. Like they're kind of but let's call them not right. Because I can kind of do that flippy thing. You got Labour, you got SNP, you got Plaid Cymru, you've got the Greens. So you've got your left voters are splitting up their votes based on their personal preferences, as opposed to being forced into voting for one other party, which is the alternative. Now that's how it works in the States, is that people who would be SNP, who would be Green, who would be Plaid Cymru, or even those sort of maybe more like, centrist, like Lib Dem types, they would all be forced to vote for the Democrats. And then you get a better counter. So there's problems in each system. I'm not going to say, the one's perfect. You just kind of have to play with the benefits, the strengths, and weaknesses of your own system. Labour lost Scotland by opposing independence, and Scotland is more progressive. Yeah, we talked about that. Scotland wants to remain in the EU while English favored Brexit. There's a lot of other things that make it hard to do a comparison of Scottish Labour and English Labour, and the divides between those internal parties, and then how the SNP itself is an alternative to Labour in that way. Was it not Romney Care? No, so Obamacare was not straight up Romney Care. Obamacare started off much left. So part of the problem was Obama didn't appreciate in 2008 the extent to which Republicans were really going to sabotage his entire presidency, because he assumed naively that they would treat him like a white man. He assumed that, okay, we have this situation where people have their, you elect their president, and then there's a honeymoon period where members of the other party will even say, okay, well, look, you got us, you won. Clearly, you have some sort of mandate, some sort of agenda, authenticity here that people want you to enact, and so we're going to give you some time. No. So what the Republicans did without really, in hindsight, we know this, they went into the Obamacare, the ACA negotiations, and they kept trying to push, like, oh, we're not going to vote for it unless you do this. We're not going to vote for it unless you do that. And at the time, bipartisanship was seen as credibility. The idea of getting Republicans on board, which is what Democrats had done in the past on things like, when it came to issues of national concern, that they would be able to get a couple moderate Republicans by giving some concessions. And what instead the Republicans did was they just pushed it as far as they could right and then refused to vote for it anyway. So if you want to say Obama was guilty of anything, it was having some sort of trust in the idea that Republicans would be good faith actors. It was a fundamental flaw in that his notion of unifying America is something that Republicans would even honor. And the fact is that they just want to maintain white supremacy. So no, it wasn't Romney Care. One Nation Party in Australia, very right wing. Okay, I won't watch videos about Pauline then. English people can actually drink more coffee these days. Tea is for the toffs. Well, I know that everywhere I've gone to, except when I visited COG, if I'm honest, and maybe that's just an age thing, but if you go into anyone's house, anytime I've ever gone into anyone's house in the UK, the first question after you get like, oh, how lovely to see you, how are you? And then the next one is, shall I put the kettle on? Or would you like a cup of tea? Sometimes people will offer coffee, but no, tea is super, 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 super popular in my experience. Even Bush believed tried-viewed bipartisanship. Wasn't No Child Left Behind a bipartisan bill? Yeah, up until Obama, there was credibility associated with the idea that you would get some people on your side to vote for you. And that was a badge of honor in terms of it shows that you could get stuff done. Like beyond the pure politics, you could actually get things done and bring people together. Now it's almost as if it's, doing anything bipartisan on the right, at least, is a sign that you're a sellout. And it's you're dirtying yourself up with Democrats as opposed to being pure. So, it's at this point, we're looking at closer to a sort of one-party rule, because divided government is just completely useless. Okay, so sounds like what the Italians do, except instead of shall I put the kettle on, it's have you eaten? Yes, very good. All right, well, I think that's, oh my gosh, look at how perfectly I've timed this. We are 2 minutes away from the top of 2 hours. Didn't need another break. I managed to do it with just a single break. My position on this is I obviously want a more progressive, a more left America. I like the solutions I see in Germany in terms of, so many things that we could do here that American businesses wouldn't do because they would cut off their nose to spite their face almost. Like this idea now in Germany that they instituted after the 2008 financial crisis that we have right now a bunch of employers who aren't bringing in any revenue, but they still have their rent expenses, they still have all their, employee expenses. How do we stop them from firing everybody in order to, and then later on hiring them again? And what the German government allows you to do is like drop down the number of hours that you have to work to be considered full-time, but still be a full-time worker. So maybe you go down to 10 hours a week, which the employer, hey, it's not 37 and a half. So they can kind of cover that. And then when the recovery happens, they expand the number of hours. So we don't throw people into unemployment. You have reduced employment by your employer, the government tops it up, and there's a continuity then of employer and employee relations so that the economy is less disrupted. That's a brilliant idea. What do we have in America? We have literally 6 to 9 million people all getting thrown out of work, all flooding into the unemployment insurance program. They're not processing it in enough time. The system can't handle this overload, and all of these people are now officially out of a job. They have to start the process over of employment again. Why can't we be smarter about this? Why don't we have, say capitalism with a more humane face or whatever? But why can't we have something that is obviously so conducive to maintaining economic stability? Well, oh my gosh, because Republicans don't want to have to pay taxes so that people who aren't working get a paycheck. Yeah, but it's cutting off your nose to spite your face. You could be getting in so much more economic benefit by not disrupting the economy later on. And so those are the things that I would like to see more of a European approach from in the US. On the other hand, when the federal government fails on the monumental scale that Trump has failed with the coronavirus, you want to talk about the disaster that was launching the Obamacare website? That was nothing compared to how poorly the federal response has been organized from Trump. And when people see the federal government failing, they just think that you can't trust the federal government. So there's a whole feedback loop. But anyway, Kurzarbeit. Yeah, exactly. Kurzarbeit means we don't all lose our jobs. Yes. You want to compare German unemployment rates to American unemployment rates at the end of May and see where things are. And again, if you have this program, you don't have to flood unemployment insurance and all the other kinds of things. Let's see. Thanks for voicing all that. Yeah. Po Mama Sid. That's, I get on here and I just talk at you for 2 hours. And sometimes people turn up. Yeah, we're really lucky here. Even freelancers are being compensated. I can't even tell you how much I feel safe living in Germany. I feel, the psychological benefit of just kind of knowing those systems exist. And also having, a woman who has a scientific background leading the pandemic response in Germany. It's so nice to be, and the thing is that she's, tends to be center right. She's not a massive, huge progressive, but she's such a competent manager that people will forgive you a lot if they feel like you can run stuff, or willing to kind of like complain about things. And she's gotten beaten up over the Syrian refugees and everything else. But I think I personally I feel breathe a sigh of relief to know that Merkel is in charge. Republicans will tell you that public services don't work, and then they prove it when they get elected. Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, the United States is on the brink of losing its own postal service. This is how poorly managed the federal government is being organized right now. How are we going to, Amazon, eBay, all of these companies assume a functioning postal service, and the federal government under Bush and the Republicans demanded that the U.S. Postal Service always have enough money on hand to fund 50 years worth of employee pensions. No other company, airlines don't have to do that, even for 3 months of expenses. No one else has to do that. And that diversion of funds and resources into pensions for 50 years worth of stuff has just meant that they're going completely bankrupt. So we might end up seeing, because of Trump, the destruction of the U.S. Postal Service, which is something that's in the Constitution. It's federally mandated that Congress has to organize, or that the federal government has to do. And this is exactly what they do. They destroy it, they underfund it like public education, and then they say, oh, well, we can't really count on public education, but market forces will ensure that the schools are competing to give kids the best education. So let's divert all this public money into over to a Catholic school or a private, elite college prep school. That's a better use of your taxpayer funded stuff rather than stuff for the community. Republicans are evil. mean, I know individual Republicans are nice people, but generally their entire policy, like the entire party, is a bunch of awful racists who want to destroy everything. I guess that's not very charitable. Let's see, what else do people have to say? Can probably actually change that, conservatives in English-speaking countries. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to speak to Canadian issues or Australian politics or Irish politics. I really can't. So I tend to limit it to the US and the UK because I don't want to talk out of school. It's like they read Schumpeter, but the only part where he says doing these things, not the part where he says will lead to the end of capitalism. I hope I got that. Schumpeter? Yes. I don't know that author, but I probably should. All right, well, I've now faffed on until 5 after the hour, so we're officially done with Weekend Winters. It is gorgeous out, and if this was a normal day, everyone would be in the parks, everyone would be enjoying themselves. I think what I can do here is maybe bring up a little of the walking out music. Can we get a little bit of background there? Isn't that kind of nice? I want to tell you, this is kind of funny. I'll tell you about a picture a friend sent me when the lockdown started, and it makes me think of today because I'm looking outside and the sky is blue. Well, it's like a faded blue. I remember being in Gran Canaria, and the sky was a deep kind of almost like vibrant blue. Like it was more blue. Like I almost felt like it was blue enough where was seeing the edge of space. Like it had this depth to it that was just so blue. Ours is today's blue is more like a sort of got a fog over it, a bit of a gray blue, but it's still a sunny sky. And just getting back to the picture, someone had sent me a picture of Urlaub or Vacation 2020, and the picture was of a woman who had stuck like half her body out the window, and it was so if you're looking at the window, you could see the bottoms of her feet, like she was sort of lying on a plank or some sort of bed, and her naked legs and her naked butt, and then that was it. So it's like you can't leave your house, so you just have to sun your hinder and your back legs out your front window, and that's kind of the vibe I'm feeling today. I feel like I should lean out the window and just stick my arm out and get some sun on it. Oh, I want to go outside. Right, guys, I'm sure we're going to do more happy hours. If you're really bored, we had a good session of D&D last night. I kicked so much ass. Oh, so in our D&D games, yeah, you kind of have to like go into like the second half of it. But I did a whole bunch of research on how to play a cleric. And did I bring the noise and the funk to that game last night? I was like, so that's on the channel if you want to have a watch. There's also the Wednesday night game that's happening now at a ridiculous time. When I have my real life back, I cannot be up till 4 in the morning doing D&D, but it's allowed now during the lockdown because I can work whenever. And of course, I'll be back next Sunday. Hopefully with I did nothing to prepare for the show, so hopefully I'll have more prepared next time. I've been Christy. Y'all been awesome. Thank you for coming by. Thank you for your time and attention. Whoa, that's way too loud. Oh my gosh, that's so loud. All right, way too loud. All right, I'm gonna hit stop music now, and stop video now, and stop everything. So yes, until next time, guys, I have been Christy. You have been awesome. Have a great one, and we'll see each other again very soon. Okay, bye-bye.